afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Nebraska History and the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is John Schleicher. I'm Statewide Services Coordinator here at the Historical Society. I'd like to introduce you and present our speaker for the Brown Bag today. David Murphy is Senior Research Architect in the Research and Publications Division here at the Historical Society. Many of you know him through his work with Czech culture in Nebraska and also on our Czech exhibit that we did here at the Historical Society a few years ago. David will be speaking to us today on the old country roots of Czech-American landscapes. Let's welcome Dave.
Thank you, John. It's always fun to talk about one of my favorite collections of buildings. I was trying to think of a way to put this in perspective on the way over here today, and I thought of a story maybe that might illustrate why we should be interested in collections such as this. When I first started looking at buildings in the landscape, maybe a couple of years ago, or a little longer, I'm not real sure, I found that we could look at buildings and come back into the office and then look at texts on American architecture or a history of American architecture, and we couldn't find any information on approximately 90% of these buildings. That created a real problem. That led us to start looking at them in much more detail, doing really primary research on both the buildings and the land records associated with them. And as the patterns started to emerge, what I figured out is that there are really many different histories of American architecture or histories of Nebraska architecture. And the problem was that none of this was really in print and available for people to find out about. I think if you've been paying attention to what's been going on in the field of history over the past few decades, you might get part of this point, and that is that what we thought we knew, say, about the American West or about American history often ends up looking very different when it's, say, told from a Native American point of view or from a Latina point of view or from a Czech point of view. So what we end up having really are, at this moment in time, an attempt to piece together the many different stories which hopefully someday will comprise the bigger story of the people in any particular geographic location. Another thing that I hope you get out of this is that when we start to look at artifacts in the landscape or artifacts in a museum, the studies recently are starting to look at them in terms of the kind of documents that they can provide us with information that we don't find in textual information. So we're piecing together a much bigger, broader, and hopefully more interesting story of peoples in a geographic location now than we used to be able to do when we only looked at say, pieces of paper in an archive or a library. We're very grateful, of course, for those pieces of paper. We couldn't really do without them. But I hope we can begin to see now how the things that are still present from our past in the landscape are often also important documents that will help us piece together that history. Those of you who have been coming to the Brown Bags or maybe watching this on TV have seen a lot of the different stories now that are beginning to emerge from artifact studies, landscape studies, and historical studies. The group that I want to talk about today, and I hope also that we won't just see this as a history of Czech-American architecture. I hope that in the end that you will see that the buildings themselves give us a much greater feeling for the lives of these people from our past and the lives that kind of continue to reverberate today in the descendants of Czech-Americans. Hopefully also we'll be able to look at all of the other immigrant groups eventually and piece together their stories in a little more detail than we have been able to in the past. Now the maps on the screens right now show you the settlement patterns of the Czechs in Nebraska as they appeared in 1891 to 93 from a census published by the Hospodář, an agricultural journal of the Czech-American community. The slide on the right shows where those same immigrants were coming from in the old country. The old country, the piece of it that I'm showing you now, are the historic Czech lands comprised of Moravia on the east and Bohemia on the west. And you can see we can't just say that Czechs from the Czech Republic were coming to Nebraska, we see that basically they're concentrated in this arc that's running from western Moravia through central Bohemia and most of the south of Bohemia. Now, when they came to this country, they settled basically in areas that were open to settlement at that time. So part of that is historical circumstance. We may like to say, well, they found some landscapes that reminded them of the old country, and to some extent that is true, but it's also true that they couldn't settle where settlement had already occurred. If the land was already occupied, they had to move westward and occupy unsettled lands. You can see the heart of the major Czech settlements that still exist today. For example, around Saline County, centered in Cretin-Wilbur, up in the Czech Alps of Saunders and Butler County, Clarkson and Colfax County, Knox Valley, and some smaller settlements out in the far western part of the state. Now, if we look at a map of this settlement, we see that there are people of Czech descent in virtually every county in Nebraska, although the centers are still located around the centers that you see here. The reasons that they came to the United States are fairly complex. We can see them in a couple of different ways, both a push and a pull. The push we can see from this Hospodář cover on the left screen, showing the conditions in the old country at the time of the immigration. It's a great cover contrasting freedom and liberty on the left with despotism and war on the right. And the old country was, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, seemed to be constantly at war during this period. Young people were being conscripted into the service. Many were dying for causes that seemed very, very remote to the Czech people. In contrast to that, America, of course, was considered the land of freedom, and we have the immigrants on the boat on the right-hand slide overlooking the Statue of Liberty in the New York Harbor with all of the promise and so forth that gave them. Not everybody, of course, was able to come. The Czech immigration was largely an immigration of families, but many times the elders were either unable to come because of health reasons, or they simply didn't have the economic resources to make that kind of a trip. This is a straw-decorated box that was brought into the Colfax County settlements around 1869. It's a very typical box from a Czech peasant community, decorated with little pieces of straw, and you can see what an imaginative kind of decoration can be produced from very simple materials. But I think what's most important, if you read the saying on top of the box, Ať žijú moji rodiče, let my parents live, indicates to some extent the sorrow that some of them faced in having to leave family members behind. Another example of that, this love of the old country, somewhat being forced to leave, perhaps against their will, is this diary kept by Adolf Josef Kratochvíl, who was also a settler into Colfax County in the 1880s. Most of the diary is illustrated, as you see here, with pictures from the old country, memory pictures that reminded him of landscapes that he had left behind. And the rest of the diary is basically prose longing for the life of the old country, a life that was very rich in social life. If we look at the architectural landscape of the old country, we can see what incredible beauty they did happen to leave behind. And fortunately for people of Czech descent who may go back, much of that country, the important historic precincts of the country, have been preserved in a condition very much like they were at the time of the immigration. We start out with a couple of views from the capital city of Prague. The view on the right is the Old Town Square, the center of the Old Town. And you can see how rich of history the buildings give you in terms of the landscape. It's basically a medieval town laid out in the Gothic period with very narrow winding streets, the old square being the primary place of congregation of the community, the Gothic teen church in the background, the overlay of Renaissance and Baroque houses on front of that. One of the major attractions of the square, shown on the slide on the left, the old town hall tower clock, which was added to the town hall tower beginning about 1410. It's an amazing piece of work. It took approximately 50 years to construct. It's really in 3 parts. At the bottom, the circular motif is a calendar, basically focusing on astronomical figures and so forth. So it turns with the seasons of the year, indicating the months. The second large disc in the middle of the slide is the clock itself, which keeps track of the hours and the minutes. And then at the top is a musical box, which opens at the top of every hour, and figures of the saints and the apostles come out of those doors and rotate around, and then close when the hour is finally struck. Other landscapes where Czechs were very familiar. This is also in Prague, the Charles Bridge, one of the most important landmarks connecting the 2 main precincts of the town, the Old Town with the Lesser Quarter on the other side, which we're looking at here, and the Hradčany, or the Prague Castle, on the hill in the background. On the right is one of the squares at the Old Town side of the Charles Bridge, and you can see what rich architectural character is evident in the city of Prague. It's an amazing secret in a way, because it was so well preserved and was unavailable to most visitors during much of the communist regime. Other towns and villages where Nebraska immigrants came from: Telch, an old medieval town shown on the left-hand slide with its irregular square, the fountain in the middle, surrounded by burghers' houses, the church at the far end of the square. Česká Budějovice on the right with its very formal, regular, very large square surrounded by houses, and the old town hall, the large building shown at the left of that particular slide. And then the villages. The Czech immigrants predominantly, I had mentioned they were an immigration of families, they were also predominantly an immigration of former peasants. As opposed to upper class settlers, they were primarily farmers, many of whom had been forced out of farming because of lack of land to farm on and the increasing industrialization in the old country. Many of them came back here and reestablished a farming kind of lifestyle. These are 2 very typical villages: Plastovice on the left, and you can see its village green surrounded by farmhouses, and Holešovice on the right with its community pond, water pond, in the center of the village green. There are really several different kinds of village arrangements, but I think if we look at the way the farming villages were organized and compare that with the way they were organized in the New World, we will see some of the conflicts that began to develop that needed to be solved. One of the more common village arrangements is called a Straßendorf, or a street village. You see here Lysovice in Moravia. You can see all of these are farmsteads, individual farmsteads, but they're lined up side by side on both sides of a street with a creek running down the middle. Ejipovice, the slide over here on the right, shows you a typical arrangement of these farmsteads all lined up next to each other. Holešovice again, both in plan and a view of it with its little chapel in the village green. You see it's organized in a circular motif. This is considered a very old Czech form of settlement, where all of the farmsteads now, and these are complete farmsteads, are lined up side by side, but they enclose their own private village green. And you can get a sense now of farming communities having a very rich social life as a result of this clustered kind of settlement. The other thing I might want to point out, you see all of these rectangulars surrounding the village. Each day farmers would leave their village and go to outlying fields, maybe 1, 2, or 3 of these very small fields, and they would work those each day and then come back to the village at night. Part of the problem is, as the population of the village grew, these parcels of land kept getting smaller and smaller, to the point where it was impossible to make a living on such a small plots of ground. That was one of the push factors leading to the immigration. But that social life was extremely important, as you might guess, to a communal people. Here we see a slide that a colleague of mine took for me in southern Poland on the left, showing the remnants of that field system. And you can kind of imagine what the old country might have looked like with all of these small plots, a very rich kind of landscape that develops from that geometry. Under communist rule, of course, the collectivization movement wiped out all of those fields in the Czech lands, so that today you see fields much larger sometimes than even our largest fields over here in Nebraska. But you can see how important that was. This is a backdrop curtain from the Crete Sokol Hall showing a Moravian village scene, and on the hill in the backdrop you can see the little patchwork quilt of the old country fields commemorated here in Nebraska. Now let's compare the two again. I think we have, this is the village of Plastovice in southern Bohemia. On the right, the village proper itself and the outlying fields. Here's a map of the Czech settlement up at Pichelville in Knox County, Nebraska. It's kind of coded. The darkest areas are the earliest homesteads, and as you get lighter, it's the later homesteads being filled in by later Czech immigrants. Each of the green dots are individual farmstead units, and you'll notice how they're lined up along the creek bottoms, fairly close together in this particular sense, and the early roadway system followed the creeks, and where the creeks meet the major valley, the red dots indicate public kinds of structures, cemeteries, the store, the hall, and so forth. But what's interesting, to me at least, is you can take this whole village and it would comfortably fit within that little green dot in the American landscape. So you can see how spread out a particular village was here in the New World. That made social relations very difficult. You had to travel a long distance in order to meet with your neighbors. But the interesting thing about them being lined up like this is that whenever a neighbor was traveling along the road, going someplace else, you'd have passed right in front of your neighbor's house, so the neighbors were constantly in contact with each other by way of that kind of travel. We'll get into a little more detail about how community was made possible in the new landscape later on in the show. One of the ways the Czechs did this is they manipulated the land survey system. The Homestead Act required that each homesteader live on their own parcel of land. So you couldn't create an old country village. You had to live out on your own land. That's what pushed the separation of these villages. But Czechs used some methods to try to settle close to each other. One is to take out a long, 1/4 mile wide homestead that's a mile long. It has some other advantages in that you get some bottom land, some slope, and then some upland, so that you can carry on your diversified farming. But you see what happens now. Here's the major road of the Pichelville community, the village road. Here's the center. And if you take out a 1/4 mile strip of land, then the farmsteads are only a 1/4 mile apart instead of a 1/2 mile or maybe a mile apart in some other cases. Then later, as the elder passed away and the land was passed to the sons, in this case, Mr. Marshall, Ignaz Marshall, divided his land in this fashion so that the sons were even closer together. So now these farmsteads are really only 1/8 of a mile apart. So they continually tried to keep things as close together as possible so that you could have some kind of social life. The farmsteads themselves, I've already indicated, you might suspect are quite different than what we think of as a farmstead in the New World. Very typically, one of the main patterns is shown here of a farmstead in Majica in South Bohemia. The slide on the left shows the whole farmstead unit lined up side by side with other farmsteads right up on the village square or the village street. If we look at that farm in plan, here we see the front or the roadway side of it and the large gate which leads into a private interior farm courtyard. This is the main outdoor working space of the Czech farmstead. On one side, in this case on the right, we have the house part of the farm unit right here, behind which is a cow shed and then a horse stable, a hay barn, and then various other functions, pigsty, chicken coops, and at front the granary. So you see the granary at the front on the left and the main part of the house facing the village street on the right side. You'll also notice here, and this is a pattern I want you to kind of be aware of, there is no door, there's no person door on the front of the house. All of the people enter first into the farm courtyard and then through a single door into the heart of the house. And this pattern will show up later on, even over here in the New World. We can get glimpses occasionally of what those farmsteads look like. Ejepovica, a view of a gate open on the left-hand side. You can see the farm buildings kind of indicated, lined up. All one structure, really. In many cases, a single roof would wrap around and shelter those buildings. Here's an abandoned one on the right, and you can see the farm courtyard is just wide enough to turn a wagon and a team of horses around in, and divided very typically with domestic kinds of services on one side. The hay barn is always at the back of the farmstead, and then the other service buildings on the opposite side. In Nebraska, we can see kind of occasionally, and perhaps I should say quite often, remnants of this relationship constructed in a different way over here. This is a view of the Pavelka farmstead of my Aunt Tania fame in Webster County, Nebraska. The plan on the right shows you the farmstead unit as a whole. Here we have the county road, the front of the house, which has no door. I'll show you that later. You enter into the farm courtyard and then turn around to get in the back door of the house. On one side are all of the poultry sheds and the machine shop and so forth. At the back, again, is the main barn. This view here shows the courtyard with the barn, the poultry sheds on one side, and grain storage on the opposite side. Corn crib and granary shown here. The rest of the enclosure in this particular case is accomplished by tree plantings. And if you look at the way the trees are planted, you do get a very tight enclosure around most of that farmstead. A couple of other examples. Not all of the farms, of course, are as elaborate as that small one I just showed you, but you still get the main idea of a farm courtyard on one side, the house, agricultural buildings on the opposite side. We also have a pattern, and this is a very small farmstead unit, perhaps more like the size that most of the Nebraska immigrants occupied, where everything is just in a single line, and the courtyard is on the door side. And then next to that, you would have another single line farmstead of your neighbor facing your courtyard. In this particular case, you have a simple two-room house behind which is a cow shed and a stable, and that's the whole farmstead unit. Now we do get glimpses again of that old country pattern now coming to the New World and representing some very distinct architectural traditions here in Nebraska's landscape. On the left is the Vesely House in Knox County, Nebraska, a three-room log-constructed dwelling with its two windows on the front gable, the door on the side. This gable faces the public road some distance away. But notice at the back we have another building attached under that single roof, and this is the old cowshed. This is the more common pattern. We have not found a house with several buildings attached, but we have found several examples of the house with at least the cowshed attached to the back of the dwelling. Over on the right, from southeastern South Dakota, the Vompol house, not really its house, but you see a very long, narrow farm building. And what we have here, a cellar entrance that's to a cellar down below this room. This door leads into a storage chamber. The second door at the back leads into the cowshed with its own hay loft and mangers. And then the third door at the back leads into the horse stable with its own mangers and its own hay shed above. So that's kind of a remnant of the farm building part of that old country arrangement. More typically, what we see are fairly distinct buildings constructed as separate units, kind of following the American pattern now of always building separate units instead of attaching. We do still see the pattern from the old country in the landscape, even though it's separate. If you take this construction and attach it to several others, it's exactly the same kind of horse stable as they used in the old country. The door's off center so that you don't come in right behind your horses. You come in on a stall dividing line. This building has 3 different stalls on the back wall, which is the way the old country stables were arranged. This is not an American barn. This is an old country stable. Another pattern that shows up, occasionally at any rate, are the dovecotes. which we're finding on more and more of the Czech farms. This is a view inside the Mlady stable. It's up basically under the eaves, and you see the little dovecotes, even with a little gable cut out for each of the pigeons. The farmstead and the house, you can see, we'll take a look at other patterns that are still in Nebraska's landscape. Two views now. The one on the left is at Kozím in Bohemia, and you can see a very long, low building, narrow. This is an entire farmstead unit, but at the front of it is the house with its double windows, full dovetail horizontal log construction, very typical of Bohemian craftsmen, Czech craftsmen. The view on the right is the Růžička house in Knox County, Nebraska. Now you can't see it because it's got American clapboarding on it to make it look more American, but its construction system is identical with this one, full dovetail horizontal log construction covered with clapboards. At the back, this large green roof is the log horse stable, and if you picked it up, you could haul it over here and attach it right to the back of this house if you wanted. But if we look inside at these now, we'll see that the pattern is exactly the same. The old country spatial arrangement is initially used in Nebraska as well. The Kozím farmstead plan is shown here on the left. And I'm showing you the whole farmstead, but I want to focus on the house part, which is these three rooms right here. You see the front gable, a single door entering into the heart of the house, in this case an entry vestibule, a black kitchen, which is a very old medieval feature. It was outlawed long before the immigration to this country, so we don't see them constructed here. A living area at the back of the house, and the Světnice, or the main room, always at the front of the house. If you look at the Růžička plan, you see that the house part is in every respect identical to the Kozím house part. A single door entering into the heart, now without a black kitchen, a very narrow chamber that you would think maybe is only wide enough to be a hallway, but in fact you see it doesn't lead anywhere. It has a single window at the back. You see the stove flue. This was the original kitchen of this particular house. The main Světnice, the main room of the house, always at the front, and in this case a storage and sleeping chamber at the back. Several examples of that three-room house, which a Czech scholar has called the quintessential Czech house because it has the three essential parts: a living area, an entry kitchen area, and a storage chamber. And we have several examples still extant. On the left, the Pecan house in southeastern South Dakota that does have its narrow chamber divided sort of like a black kitchen, but where the back room is used as the kitchen and the front is an entry. A very rare example of that. In the Vosika house out in Cheyenne County, Nebraska, a very large three-room example of that quintessential Czech house type. More typically, however, we see many variations on this theme. There isn't just one architecture, even for the Czech-American, but we see variations on the theme which fit the patterns nicely. We have several examples of the single-room dwelling shown here on the left at the Brabitz farmstead in Saline County. Basically, this was built for the grandmother after the grandfather died, and it follows a traditional pattern of having a výměnník on the farmstead for the elder parents to retire into. So the son takes over the main house, the elder parents retire into a small one or sometimes two-room dwelling. That's what this was used for. Basically, it's the Světnice part of that three-room dwelling I was showing you. The same pattern shows up in western Nebraska. In this case, it's called a bunkhouse. It's occupied sometimes, we think, by hired people, more often by the sons or the elder parents of the farmers here in Nebraska. Another variation on that theme, a more modest variation, which we find built by Moravians here in Nebraska, is a two-room dwelling. Shown here, the plan is from the Kopacek house in Butler County, Nebraska. You see that it has the narrow senia, or entry kitchen, and only the Světnice, a large room at the front of the house. You didn't have the resources to build the storage chamber on the back of the house. So now we have a two-room dwelling. We can see this happening at the Sedlacek house in South Dakota in the slide on the right. The original house is the limestone structure right here. And you can see from the location of the chimneys, we have a narrow entry kitchen chamber and a single svietnica attached over here. Then later on, as this farmer prospered, then he builds another brick addition to the house and adds a storage chamber to it. So he goes from the old country two-room dwelling into the more typical larger three-room type of dwelling. More typically, I think, here in the Nebraska context, we find a different kind of two-room dwelling that's still related to the pattern. This is the Schreier-Driak home up in Knox County, Nebraska, a view of it on the left, and its plan on the right. And what you see now, since you no longer have need for that black kitchen, basically the narrow room has been pulled out of this house and simply the two pieces put together now. So you have the svietnica in the front, the komora at the back, and the door now, instead of going into that narrow chamber, goes into the main room, the svietnica, which is taking over the cooking functions of the house as well. So the kitchen svietnica remain the main room of the house, and that's where the door is placed. Another variation on that theme is a little bit more confusing and perhaps more problematic, but we have a number of two-room dwellings in Nebraska, Czech communities, that have two doors. We have a view of the front part of the Oliverius house in Cheyenne County on the left, and then on the right, the Brabitz, the original Brabitz house in Saline County on the right. You see its front gable with its typical paired windows, but if you look under the porch, there are two doors now. There's a door into each of the two different chambers. This doesn't seem to follow the pattern that we've been talking about of a single door off of the farm courtyard. But if we look back a little bit further in time, we get some hints as to where perhaps that's coming from. The view on the right is a 1741 dwelling in the Moravian Brethren communities in southeastern Pennsylvania. And we know quite a bit about this particular dwelling from documents that survive. But basically, here you have that two-door scheme again, and it goes back to a very, very old pre-medieval house type where you have basically a single living room for people on one side and a stable under the same roof on the other side. So one door goes into the stable, the other door is the people door. And that survives in several houses in Nebraska and South Dakota. The one from South Dakota shown on the right-hand screen follows the pattern exactly. It's a two-room house with a single door into the house part. The second door at the back goes into the cowshed. Now there are several variations that we might call more Czech-American in their influence, where new patterns start to show up in response to the American situation. This is the Ignatz Marshall House up in Knox County, both a view of it on the left and its plan on the right. We'll focus on the plan. You'll see that basically here you have the old two-room dwelling without its narrow entrance chamber. And now we see the emergence of the kitchen taking the place of that old, narrow, old country kitchen. And it's also pulling the kitchen out of the main parlor, or the main living room of the house. But notice that this house still only has one door. It's coming off of the farm courtyard side of the house, which is right here. The road is way off to the right. So it looks like the front is facing the farm courtyard. And the single door goes into the most important room of the new Czech-American house, the kitchen. Informants have told me who've lived in the community for a number of years that they've been in this house many, many times and were never invited into the parlor. They never saw this room. This was the family part of the house. Gives you some idea of how important the new kitchen now was to the Czech-American. We find that happening in a number of different ways. Two plans now of the old Vosika house in Cheyenne County. The slide on the right shows its original configuration on the inside. Single door, the narrow cooking chamber, the stairway up to the loft, the stairway down to the basement underneath, the main living area at the front of the house, storage chamber at the back. When the Pokornys purchased this house shortly before the turn of the century, they remodeled it on the inside. The outside remained exactly the same, but what did they do? They replaced the narrow chamber, widened it into a larger kitchen with 2 doors now, but still at the heart of the house, the only room many, many people ever saw, put 2 bedrooms at the back, and had a somewhat smaller main living parlor at the front of the house. So that pattern keeps repeating itself over and over to the point to where we feel that that's significant in terms of this architectural tradition. Out in Webster County again, the Pavelka farmstead that you'll know as the My Antonia farmstead from the novel by Willa Cather. We have a view, and I'll show you what happens to this tradition as it evolves over time. The slide on the right shows a view from the road, the county road, which is the front of the house. You see the barn that I showed you at the back of the farmstead, and the house front has no door, as I mentioned to you earlier. It started out with this part of the house as the original construction. You notice it's a doorless gable that faces the road. Here's a view, isometric view. The door into the back, into the main room, or the old Svetnica now, the main living room of the house. And there's a storage chamber in the front. So now the activity area reorients itself to the farm unit. Since you don't see much activity out the front anymore, that's a county road, your neighbors are spread out all over the place, that isn't the main center of activity anymore. It gets replaced with the farm unit at the back of the house. Now when the Pavelka family added on to this dwelling, it's, I think, very significant. The addition is right here. So now we have the same old front door leading into the heart of the house or the kitchen. You add bedrooms and storage chambers onto one side. Everything is oriented to the farm courtyard back here. Bedrooms replace storage chamber, but now the kitchen and the old storage chamber gets turned into a formal parlor. And if you read My Antonia, people do get invited into this parlor now, which has pictures of the old country on the wall and so forth. You might find it interesting to compare this plan arrangement with and follow the novel in terms of its layout. You may recall how Cather says life somehow comes and goes by the back of the house in this particular case, and what we find is that's a very old country arrangement. The back of the house meaning the kitchen to an American, and there is no front door in this particular case. On the right, I just show you the cover from one of the many Czech translations of My Antonia, Naše Tonička, a very popular novel even in the old country. Now I want to talk a little bit about community. We've looked at the farmstead unit and the house. How did Czechs create community out of this very spread out American landscape? We're back at Pishelville again, a map of the entire community, and here's the main community center, a free-thinking hall. But it's also important to know that Czechs are not entirely a homogeneous group of people. They're just like you and I. They're composed of people who have different ideas, and that's very characteristic of the Czechs, and it makes them a very interesting people to study. The slides up here now are showing the main community centers up at Netolice in Valley County, Nebraska. One part of the community focusing on St. Wenceslas Church, the other part of the community focusing on Slavine Hall, the free-thinking hall just a mile down the road or 2 miles down the road. I think you can get maybe a quicker idea of the heterogeneity of Czechs if we look first at cemeteries. And in describing the 4 different kinds of cemeteries, you'll see how diverse in terms of their thinking they were. Both views are from the Brainerd, just south of Brainerd community, a Czech-American community. Here you see the entrance gate to the Česko-národní cemetery, or the free-thinking cemetery. And if you go down the road where the trees get larger, that's where the entrance to the Czech Catholic cemetery is. And further down the road, well beyond the car, is just a community cemetery. So we have 3 different cemeteries stacked side by side in Brainerd, Nebraska. This is a view from the Czech National Cemetery side looking toward the Czech Catholic cemetery side. And you see the line right here, and beyond the line, they're all crosses, indicating the Czech Catholic cemetery. In front of the line, no crosses at all. The Czech national cemeteries, denoted by Česko-národní hřbitov, you see typically on gates, like this one at Howells, Nebraska. This is a view from outside the cemetery leading in. The slide on the right is looking back out toward the gate from inside. Many of the national cemeteries focus on some distinctive landscaping techniques which make them look very distinct from a lot of the other American cemeteries. Here you see trees lined up on either side of the lane forming an allée, which is one of those very distinctive landscape elements. Now we move to Dwight and show you the Dwight Catholic Cemetery. Another very distinctive feature of most of the cemeteries are these gates. This one made by a local blacksmith, very fancy and elaborate. If you look at a detail of it here, it almost looks like the Czech tulip design to some extent in the gate posts. The Catholic cemeteries typically do not focus nearly as much on natural plantings as do the national cemeteries. A third kind of cemetery, this one up at Wahoo, are the Czech Presbyterian or the Czech Protestant cemeteries. Their congregations form their own cemetery associations and design their own as well. Both views are from the Wahoo Czech Presbyterian Cemetery, the gate on the left, and another on the right of the very interesting planting features that you find in many cemeteries, bushes in this case, or trees planted at the four corners of the family plot. Another view of a Protestant cemetery, this one at Sion near Clarkson, Nebraska. One of the tombstones, the Tušek family, shows the chalice on the Bible. Those were two very important symbols of the Czech Reformation movement in the Old Country, and we see those symbols surviving here. And then a view of the Novotny plot in the same cemetery with trees planted on either side of the monument. And then finally we get another kind of cemetery, what I'm calling a community cemetery, usually denoted by the name Československý. The most famous in Nebraska was at Wilbur, I think, and there was a battle there. The Catholics wanted to consecrate some ground in that cemetery and separate itself off. The freethinkers wouldn't allow it. They said this is a community cemetery open to anybody of Czech descent, regardless of their belief system. And so we do have a few of those. This is at Killian Hill up in northern Saunders County, a community cemetery that has freethinkers and, as you can tell from this cross, Catholics buried in it as well. The cemeteries themselves, I mentioned a few of the distinctive features. I don't really have time to go into them all, but a couple of views from the Old Country can show you how distinctive they are there. There's a couple of features I want to point out. That's the curbs that surround the plots. You can see in both views. And in the Old Country, they're often planted with perennial flowers, so they're constantly in bloom and come up every year. The other thing you can barely see in the slide on the right, I think maybe more visible if you look close in the slide on the right, are the cast iron grave markers in some of the cemeteries. An Old Country feature that did find its way here in a couple of forms. That is a cast iron monument in a Catholic cemetery shown on the left. There was a very famous Czech foundry over in Iowa that produced most of these, run by a person named Ondrak. And then blacksmith created wrought iron crosses of very distinct design are scattered throughout Czech Catholic cemeteries here and there in both Nebraska and South Dakota. The view on the right shows a monument up in Bonham County, South Dakota. And then the curb idea, two different variations on that in Nebraska. The first shown at St. Peter and Paul Cemetery up near Abbey in Butler County shows the curb, but it's overlaid with a ledger over the vault. And you see ledgers here on the slide on the right as well at St. Cyril and Methodius Cemetery at Plessy. But in the background here at Plessy, you see the curbed arrangement with flowers planted in it. One of the rare survivors of that tradition still being utilized here in Nebraska. The churches themselves, of course, were the main center of community activity for those that were either Catholic or Protestant. Two kind of old medieval-looking Catholic church buildings that seem to follow somewhat from old country designs at Tabor in Colfax County on the left, and the Lakeport Church up in South Dakota on the right. You notice at Lakeport, you see the fence and the cemetery gate. The church is located right in the midst of the cemetery. That's very common in the old country as well. This is one of my favorite churches. It's really it's St. Boniface Church up at Menominee in Cedar County. It's really a German Catholic settlement, but interestingly enough, there was one Czech Catholic family, the Zavadil family, and Zavadil was a stonemason and builder. He's responsible for building this church. You might note, superficially at any rate, how similar it is to a church from the old country, the one on the right at Radnica in Bohemia. Built of chalk rock, trimmed in brick, Zavadil's designs, which you can see in the two slides, draw heavily on kind of an old country architectural feel. I think the most explicit motif, this zigzag pattern, is a very common folk design from the old country. The Protestants, of course, had their own churches. This is at Sion. Both slides are from Sion in Colfax County, Nebraska. The round arch design shows up time and time again, perhaps is drawing from German sources. That's something we need to do a little more research on. Smaller congregations, there were many fewer Protestant congregations in Nebraska, but nonetheless retained much of the tradition. This is the Czech Presbyterian Church at, excuse me, I was going to say Wahoo, but it's at Prague, which we call Prague here in Nebraska. And focusing, it's very un-Presbyterian-like. It looks, in its overall design, it's got the crossing and everything in it. It looks somewhat Catholic from that point of view. But important on the front, right above the door, is that chalice motif again, so important to the Czech Protestant Reformation. As the communities became more settled here and became more confident of themselves, they tended to express themselves more fully in an architectural way. Many of the Catholic complexes are very important complexes. This is at Dwight, both slides, the parochial school on the left, and the church building shown on the right with its major landscaping effort around the church as well. And then two of the larger of the Czech Catholic congregations, both with very major buildings. I think the one on the right at Wahoo, St. Wenceslas, is perhaps the largest of the Czech Catholic churches in the state, and then the church on the left is at Brainerd, Nebraska. These are typically not drawing on old country sources anymore. They seem to be drawing primarily from the Catholic Church architectural designs at this later stage. Both of these date, I think, the 1890s on the left and just about that same time on the right. Now for the freethinkers, the community centered around the hall. And you can see how important the hall is from the slide on the right showing the Jungmann Hall up in Valley County, Nebraska. You can wonder perhaps how that many people can get into such a small building. This is one of the early halls, very simple in design. It's not too different from what happened in the very earliest years, and the slide on the right can illustrate that. This is the Shedda Barn out in Cheyenne County, Nebraska. And what's important about it is that the loft has a tongue-and-groove floor in it, and it was used on a very regular basis for dancing. So it's referred to now as the Shedda Dance Barn. Some of the early social centers were nothing more than barns or sheds built on private farmsteads. Then later on, the community organizes to build a community hall. I want to take a diverge from that slightly to show you one of my favorite stories of architectural design. that relates somewhat to these halls. We're going way back now, back to the old country, to the cathedral in the castle at Prague, a Gothic building of some note. But if you look inside at the choir, which is the first part that was built, you notice the reticulated vaulting. It's all kind of intersecting and kind of lace-like. It really pulls your eye upward. There's this upward aspiration to this building that I think is very distinct. If we move a little bit later on into the 17th century, still in the castle compound in the slide on the left, the Vladislav Hall, a late Gothic building, but notice how elaborate this vaulting becomes. Now it's curved in all planes. It intersects, creates a floral motif. That upward aspiring kind of visual character is achieved now, and this connects to later architectural styles. One architect has noted that this upward aspiration seems to characterize Czech architecture in general, and the view on the right shows you all of these spires. Prague is also known as the town of 100 spires. So even the town itself is moving upward in terms of its architectural character. That becomes more evident even as we move later into time. Now we're at Tabor in Bohemia, and we see on this gable a kind of a Gothic-looking interlacing motif with little spires pointing up. And then we go over here to Telch, and we get a similar kind of character being accomplished with what we call a lunette. The lunette is a Baroque motif showing up in the mid-17th century, very prominent in the 18th century. We even have half lunettes adorning this particular building at Telch. Notice this later edition here is composed of lunettes also. That round, that curvilinear idea was a very prominent idea in the Baroque when the lunette was invented. Some of the high-style buildings produced during that period really carry the curvilinear motif to extremes. This is a pilgrimage church at Nitsov in the Czech lands. You notice that the front wall is concave. Parts of the walls are convex. We see the reintroduction of the onion dome with its curvilinear motifs, all of it pointing upwards from the ground toward the heavens. Then later yet, toward the latter part of the 17th century, and as I said, very prominent in the 18th century, we see that what's basically a Catholic style secularized in the towns and the villages. What happens in Telch is that the burghers take an opportunity, they add a facade to the front of their old houses, putting this arcade on the front, and the new facade allows them to build varieties of Baroque, variations of that Baroque idea. Much simpler now. You notice that this wall on the right is slightly convex here, slightly concave here, and slightly convex in the middle, emphasized by turning these pilasters at a 45-degree angle. So you get the feel of an undulating wall but only barely building the undulating wall. And then more important, all of the curvilinear motifs topped by a lunette up on the gable to give you that feel that's now approximately 200 years old. Well, another century later, now in the 19th century, in the peasant villages, what happens after the peasants are freed is that many of the farmers remodel their farmhouses and do an even simpler version of that Baroque style. Now it's focused primarily on the curvilinear motifs and the lunette. The lunette seems to become the most important symbol of that idea. You see the wall is extremely flat, the decorations are very flat, and then they're just simply applied to the wall now. Very simple, but you still get that same feel, a feel that many people think is characteristic, the most characteristic of the Czech architectural styles. Well, now if we come a few years later, now we're at the turn of the 20th century in Nebraska, we see even simpler variations of that theme in the free-thinking hall designs around the state of Nebraska. On the left, we have the Bila Hora building at Verdigre, built in 1903. You see it does have a doubly curved parapet and again that single lunette. And then in 1921, on the right, in rural Pawnee County, Nebraska, the Kolar Hall produces the same effect. It's not curvilinear now, he's just zigzagging up and down on the parapet here, produces a single lunette in the center and flat pilasters to kind of break up the wall surface. So it does continue to give you that sense. So we do have about 300 years worth of variations on this architectural style all the way from the old country to the New World. We even find it to some extent on houses. Slide on the right shows you the decorative barge board on the Schreier-Driak house in Knox County, Nebraska. And then Franz Zavadil's house in Cedar County, you see the lunette barely visible there in the front gable of the house. Back to the halls. The halls now, like the churches were for the religious community, the hall is the single most important space for the free-thinking community. And in some ways, I like to think of the hall as kind of replacing the village green. The hall now becomes an interior space where the whole community can assemble and carry on their social and cultural life. Several examples of these halls are built as multifunctional structures. The view from Milligan on the left shows a hall set up for a dance. The tables off to either side and the big dance floor open for that activity. The Sokol Hall view on the right is from Crete, and you can see that it's set up with all of their gymnastic equipment so that it at that particular moment is ready for the students to come in and practice their gymnastics associated with the Sokol movement. And then at Clarkson, we have the hall set up as though it were for a theater or a play. Perhaps it's a speech now, but some kind of assembly where there's a focus on the front of the stage. And you'll notice in all of these views there was a stage, and more on that later. But these stages, there are several theater curtains that are still extant that are extremely important to the Czech cultural and architectural tradition. The one here at Clarkson, shown on the right, depicts an allegorical scene of Svatopluk and his sons. And I think it kind of summarizes the purpose of these buildings. The story of Svatopluk was that he was on his deathbed. He called his three sons together and gave them each a stick and asked them to break it, which they easily did. Then he took another group of sticks and bundled them together and asked his sons to break those. And none of them were able to do it. The principle of the story was that united we stand, divided we fall. The whole idea of if you stick together, we're going to make it. If you fall apart, you're not going to make it. And the free-thinking lodges that built these halls, that was one of their principal purposes, was to provide a place for people to get together, watch out for each other, learn the American scene, learn about American economics, learn about American farming, and eventually to integrate themselves into the larger American social and cultural context. In the meantime, however, they kept alive their old country traditions to a very great extent. Theater, I had mentioned to you, was one of the very important activities from way back in the past. And it became even more important as the Czechs began to pull themselves away from 300 years of Habsburg and Austro-Hungarian rule. This is a photograph on the right of the National Theater in Prague, and it became a symbol of the whole national revival movement, which emerged in the 19th century and continued through the freedom of the Czech Republic in the formation of Czechoslovakia after World War I. The importance of that is seen on a theater curtain in the Brainerd Hall, which depicts the National Theater as the main theme of the curtain. This was one of the more surprising things I learned in researching the Czechs, was how much they loved drama, and they were very avid drama fans and participants. And by participant I mean farmers from out on the farmsteads would come into town and become actors in very sophisticated plays. The triptych on the left is a view of one of Josef Shedovy's troops from up at Verdigris in Niobrara, Nebraska. You can see some very elaborate costuming. And the playbill on the right, I think from the 1930s, if I recall, yes, 1935, shows the participants and the title of a play that was going to be given at the Kolar Hall in rural Pawnee County, even at that very late date. And they often gave very famous plays by Czech playwrights. There were some very famous Czech playwrights, and many of their plays were given over here as well. Jirásek's play Lucerna, shown in the cover of his play on the right. This is a view from Omaha Sokol in the teens, showing the cast of the play Lucerna, which was given at Sokol, Omaha. Other connections are seen. Verklitsky's very famous play, Noc na Karlstein, a play about a night at Karlstein Castle, depicted here on a backdrop curtain from the Clarkson Hall, showing the Karlstein Castle. One of the more lovely paintings still extant on Czech theater curtains. And then, of course, to give good plays, you have to have a full set of curtains, and several of these are still extant in these halls around the state of Nebraska. I think the most complete set in terms of having the side wings as well as the backdrops is still extant up at the Slavine Hall west of Ord. I show you two variations of the several that you had to have in order to give a full repertoire of plays. A fancy interior shown here on the left, and then an urban scene shown on the right. And then, of course, as might be expected, we find backdrops that are literally from the old country. An urban backdrop at Milligan, shown on the left, which is literally a view of a town which I have not identified yet, from the old country. You can tell that from the Baroque towers and so forth. And then my favorite of all, I think, is the Bohemian Village view, shown on the right, one of the several backdrop curtains still extant at Clarkson. And then the front proscenium curtain at Slavine in Valley County, produced by what I guess we could call a naive artist, but it still depicts the castle, the Hradčany in Prague, still very, very recognizable in spite of its perhaps naive style. The other thing about the front drop here that is perhaps uncharacteristic of most of the Czech theater front curtains is the incorporation of the American style of putting advertising around the outside. Here are the front curtains with two of the more elaborate front curtains, the one on the left at Crete Sokol Hall, showing the Vyšehrad, the oldest castle compound in the city of Prague, old country, and the one on the right, perhaps easily the most elaborate of them all, is showing you a view of the castle compound in Prague, the Hradčany, from the gardens, the castle gardens. And if we follow the path, it's a very accurate depiction of the garden, the whole castle compound at the top of the hill. And note, I should have mentioned this earlier, but what you see of the church in the castle is only the choir and the Maria Teresa Tower, or the Golden Tower, the transept tower. That church took something on the order of 500 years to build. So the paintings that you see of the castle compound on Nebraska theater curtains never show the completed structure because the structure was not finished until 1929. And then below the castle, you have the lesser quarter, very accurately depicted. You can even see St. Nicholas. Well, some of that, I think, in closing, I would like to say that to Czech-Americans at any rate, even though a lot of this tradition is no longer, architecturally, is no longer being utilized, much of their memory and so forth, much of their tradition is still alive in a variety of ways. The slide on the left shows the embroidery work done just a few years ago by a Czech queen here in Nebraska, and you can see how similar the floral motifs are to the decorated house at Veselý nad Moravou in Moravia that I photographed when I was there. Memory is an interesting thing, and memory and tradition can remain alive a very, very long time. I think I showed you that with the Baroque idea. I showed you that with the changing traditions in the way the houses are organized. And I think you can still see that today in the festivals, costumes, and the foodways, which are still very much alive in Czech-American communities in Nebraska. Thank you.